Okay, so my name's Henry McGhie, and I'm part of the team behind Reimagining Museums for Climate Action, which is a design and ideas competition that's looking to radically reimagine and redesign the museum as an institution to help bring about more equitable and sustainable futures in the climate change era. And I'm delighted to be here with Tempa Gyaltsen who's the head of the Environment and Development Desk at the Tibet Policy Institute based at Dharamshala in India, and Asher Minns from the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research in Norwich in England. And we're here to hear about the work of these people. And so I think Tempa first, could you tell us about your work with climate change, please?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, every one of you there. And thank you very much for making me part of this conversation or this wonderful idea. Now, as mentioned, my name is Tempa Gyaltsen, and I'm the Executive Head of Environment and Development Desk of the Tibet Policy Institute. Tibet Policy Institute is a think tank based here in Dharamshala in North India. And our focus of research is particularly what's happening in Tibet. And my focus is on the environmental part. So what I do is I try to see the social environment impact of climate change in Tibet, and also the increasing cases of natural disasters in Tibet that we have seen in recent years. So these are the areas that we focus on, and to bring that information out to the international community, we do three things. Number one, we try to make the international community aware of why Tibet Plateau is so important. And number two, we also make ourselves, the Tibetan community here in exile, aware of the importance of Tibet Plateau and what's happening on the Tibet Plateau. And number three, which is the most important for us, is to send the information back to Tibet and make Tibetans in Tibet aware of the impact of climate change to the people, to the land, in whatever way possible, say through radio transmission, through small video clips, or through interviews, different means to make Tibetans in Tibet aware of climate change. And that's what we do.
Okay, thank you. And Asher, could I ask you the same thing? How does your work relate to climate change?
Yeah, of course. So Asher Minns, Executive Director of the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research, which is a partnership of currently 4 UK universities, one in Fudan in China, all working together, very much looking at what to do about climate change, less about what's happening with climate change, but what the responses to climate change. But my work more specifically, or my specialist area more specifically, is around communication of climate change and science communication. And that means engaging different audiences, different groups of people with climate change information, climate change knowledge, so not too different to what Tempa does, and engaging them in such a way that it does actually engage. That they feel connected with this information, that they feel, or that there's a range of responses, ways that they can behave, and what they can do about that information. A lot of science communication, climate change communication, is very much rooted in sort of disaster and crisis, and we know that pretty much disempowers almost everybody. So it's the communication, it's the same information, but it's really communicating that research so that it actually engages with who it is that I'm wanting to engage with. That might be policymakers of governments or broader than governments. It might be businesses. It might be the general public.
Okay, thank you. And Tempa, if I can turn back to you, could you say something about how you see the relationship between social justice and climate change, please?
I think there's a great interlink between social justice and climate change. in general throughout different parts of the world. But to speak particularly about Tibet, that's something that I do my work on, something that I have better knowledge about, is that now I'm sure many of you must have heard about Tibetan nomads. So almost half of Tibetan population live a nomadic life. So, and this life has been there on the Tibet plateau for more than, some people say more than 7,000 years. But we have it is a prominent society on the Tibet plateau. Unfortunately, ever since, we can say since 1950s, after Chinese occupation, and particularly in since 1980s, the Chinese government started to push Tibetan nomads out from grassland, saying that there was grassland degradation, basically desertification on many parts of northern Tibet. And some Chinese scientists and mostly Chinese policymakers blamed Tibetan nomads for the grassland degradation. But in fact, scientific papers have proved that the grassland degradation was, to some extent, was due to climate change, as any part of the world. But the situation was exacerbated by resource extraction, excessive construction works, and to some extent, due to uncontrolled grazing by nomads. So here, the whole blame went on to the nomads. So the Chinese government has used climate change to move out Tibetan nomads, which is almost 2 million people. So now what happened was the Tibetan nomads who were pushed out from those areas and put in a newly set up villages in the middle of nowhere. And they were not allowed to graze. They were not allowed to move around. So what happened? They were put into a government constructed homes with nothing to do. And they were given subsidies from the government. But at one point of time, the subsidy expires and the nomads had nothing to do. So what happens here is Tibetan nomads who were once very proud, very healthy, self-sufficient people living on the vast Tibetan grassland happily were suddenly pushed into absolute poverty. So this is, for us, it's a social justice linked with climate change, where the politics of climate change is misused on set of a community. So this is, I think, very important. I think there's a similar case in different parts of the world as well.
Okay, thank you. And Tempa, I wonder, could you tell us a bit more about your experience of what are the climate change impacts in Tibet and beyond? Like you talked about degradation of grasslands, but what are some of the other impacts?
Absolutely. Now, it's very important to understand that the Tibet Plateau, as many of you already know, that Tibet Plateau is the world's highest and the largest plateau. Tibet Plateau sits around at the average elevation of more than 4,500 meters above sea level. So some of the European mountains, the average elevation of Tibet Plateau is higher than some of the European highest mountains. So it's very high. And because of this high elevation, and also because it is not too far from equator, Tibetan Plateau experiences extreme weather conditions. When the world gets cold, Tibet gets colder. When the world gets hot, Tibet gets hotter. So the climate is extreme here, there on the Tibet Plateau. Now, when I was in Tibet back some 20 years ago, we could see snow-capped mountains throughout the year. But in recent years, since 2015, I have seen that Tibetan mountains are beginning to, the glaciers on Tibetan mountains are beginning to disappear during summer. And because of that, we are beginning to experience more and more landslide. So the most visible impact has been natural disasters. Since 2016, we have experienced floods across Tibet, something that was new to Tibetans. So when I was in Tibet, our grandparents used to say floods and natural disasters would happen only in China, not in Tibet. That was the belief back some 20 years ago. But now what used to happen in China is happening in Tibet, especially in the eastern part of Tibet. We are seeing more and more floods. Even as we talk, even now, there are many parts of Tibet experiencing floods. So problem with floods is that we are not adapt to it because we lived on a very dry land with very little rainfall. The way we have built our homes, where we have built our homes, all of that was to get maximum sunlight and to prevent the cold wind. But now because it's getting hotter and getting wetter, the kind of home that we have built is not able to face the new challenge. So which is why the impact is much more severe. That's one. Number two, we are also facing more forest fire during the summer. Now, strangely, in some part of Tibet is experiencing more heavier rainfall, but some other part of Tibet, we are having drier summer. And that is causing forest fire. And there has been many forest fire in the last few years. And number three has been serious. And we are experiencing more and more landslide. That's because of the heavy rainfall that we are experiencing. And scientific papers have proven that Tibet Plateau is experiencing increased precipitation and increased temperature rise since 1950s. But we have seen it more visible in the recent years. So this is what happened in Tibet, on the Tibet Plateau, based on regarding climate change.
Okay, thank you, Tempa. And Patrick, can I turn to you, and can you tell us something about how do you see the relation between social justice and climate change in your context?
Well, obviously Tempa's articulated a really good, I hesitate to use the word case study because it makes people look like an experiment, but yeah, a really good example of how all this comes together in the context of social justice. So Tempa there was talking about the climate change, the environmental impacts. He was talking about the nomadic people who live there. Over half the population is nomadic. He was talking about the geopolitics of China and the fact that Tibet is occupied, and the extractions of China for resources and things. So all these things come into the mix, from ancient civilizations through to resource extraction, and how that affects people. So I'm not going to be able to top that as an example, but social justice is right across climate, because as Tempa has done, climate change is about people. Yeah, it's not actually about the temperature or how much rainfall or drought. It's what this means for people and what that means for biodiversity. And if you want to be if it's not very human centric about that, the ecosystem services that people receive for free through biodiversity. So the grasslands there for Tempa, the grasslands on the Tibetan plateau are the sort of the foundation of the social ecosystem, and so you can see how all these things tie together. But to bring it, and we can look at that, almost everywhere, and even if we're not looking at politics, we can look at the power, the political ecology of who it is who actually controls what happens in a place, and who makes the decisions. So that's all to do with social justice. And I'll bring it back a bit to the UK and maybe just the sort of the northern hemisphere, where I guess 100% of the population is entirely sedentary, not at all nomadic, and even within the UK, climate is still a social justice issue for many reasons. So some of the worst places, or if we look at, say, air pollution, for example, some of the most polluted places are where the people are poorest and are least able to do anything about that. They'll just be there. We've seen massive changes in employment patterns. So certainly in the 1980s, when I was growing up, that's when all the miners' strikes and things were going on, and that was big news. But that also has not burning fossil fuels is now a big topic in avoiding dangerous climate change. But then that's also social justice, because there's skilled people working in lots of industries that are resource intensive, fossil fuel burning, and those people need to be redeployed. You can't just sort of close down coal mines or steel plants because they use lots of resources and entire communities no longer have any sort of economic well-being or social cohesion, and that's been seen quite strongly. And we can extrapolate that out around the world. So okay, coal isn't being mined very much in the UK anymore, but it's all coming from somewhere. So these sort of extrapolate further out. But then it isn't mostly, social justice doesn't only have to be about poorer people even. It can be people living in very vulnerable places to coastal erosion or sea level rise. So a wealthy community on the Norfolk coast, which doesn't really face much of a long-term future because of sea level rise and coastal erosion, then their communities need to adapt to what's going to happen. Some places will be defended, other places don't really have much of a future, so those communities need to move, and people mostly don't want to move. They actually just want to relocate their community, not be dispersed all around. So that's very much a part of how we respond to climate change. Social justice is right across the piece, and climate change is really about people, not just about what's happening in the atmosphere.
Okay, thank you, Asher. And as you say, we're reluctant to kind of draw single places out as case studies, but both of you have spoken about social justice and climate change in your own context. What do you both think what are the bigger challenges that face us all everywhere in relation to climate change, and the kind of connection between different places, and also the connection between equality and inequality in single places? And maybe I could turn to Tempa first.
So can you repeat that, please?
So as we, one of the challenges with climate change is that the impacts are different. The context is different in different places. But what do you think are the kind of common challenges that face us all wherever we are?
Thank you. Absolutely. Yes. Then this is, I think, very, very important, because climate change is, even though it's similar in many parts, almost across the globe, that we are facing climate change, but there's also localized differences, because in case of Tibet, the kind of rainfall that, when I said that we face increased rainfall, if you compare that to India or other parts, it's nothing. But if you compare that to Tibet itself, to the past Tibet, then it's severe, it's drastic. So there's a difference. And also, I think we need different approach to different places, because this is what we have always said, that sometimes the multinational organizations, they are too influenced by few governments or few sponsors or few governments who finance those organizations. But a lot of times they don't get to the root or get to the place where there are some difference of issues, and also where there's a different issue that are not allowed to come in. So we should get back to the basic. That's what we have said. Get back to the basic. That is, respect traditional knowledge, recognize traditional knowledge, and incorporate traditional way of challenging climate change, because climate change seems like new to us, but it has been there ever since human existence can. But it has been more drastic in recent years. We have always adapted to a new change. So we had traditionally we had great knowledge, great wisdom. So we have to incorporate those wisdom into everyday practice or into the government policies. So that's the one thing I think is important. And also we need cooperation between different countries, because each one of us have a slightly different issues. Small islands have issues of the sea level rise, but countries like Tibet, mountainous regions, we don't have that issue, but we have issues of landslide, forest fire, extreme weather. Because I'll give you one example. On the 7th summer of 2018, many parts of Tibetan nomads faced unheard issues. What they first faced was flooded pasture, something that was completely new to them. So people didn't know where that water suddenly came from. But now scientists believe that some of it came from melting under frozen ground. And also some of it came from the increased rainfall. And number three, some of it came from surging rivers. As the glaciers melt during the summer, the rivers that flow across Tibet are getting, the volume of the rivers are getting bigger. So that's why there's differences. So I think, I'm not too sure I'm getting it exactly, but what we need is, we need a common approach on sharing certain information, and also letting people who are not represented, people like us, if it has not been for Asher and his university, that we might not be able to attend UN conferences, climate conference that we have been attending since 2009. And such platform gives us a stage where we can tell the international community what's happening on the Tibet Plateau and why it's important. But if it has not been for Asher or one or two other universities, we would not have been able to do that. So what we need is, we need to have two approaches. One, respect local organizations, bring them to the mainstream, one. Number two, irrespective of political differences, I think we have to bring in unrepresented people into the mainstream. I think these are the two areas that is not be represented at the UN Climate Summit that I have experienced, because I go there every year. But what I have experienced is, I don't have the authority. I don't have the right to sit on a table and ask the delegates to discuss on some issues, some of the Tibet issues that is facing Tibet Plateau. So I think such unrepresented issues need to be represented, and local organizations which should be respected, I guess. I'm not too sure I gave you the right answer though.
That's great. Thank you very much, Tempa. Asher, I wonder if I could turn to you. How do you see the big challenges that kind of face all of us in our different ways?
I think they are the same, actually. So while it's very important to drill down to place and people, which is exactly what Tempa does. You know, specific people in specific places, and that's how our brain works. Yeah, we're interested in other people, but exactly as he's saying is that certainly at that global level and then that sort of international negotiation level, and actually at the science level, it all tends to be amalgamated together a bit, so that it doesn't have that sort of necessary specificity and also the necessary empathy with other people in other places in the world. But sort of coming right back out again, the impacts of climate change around the world are roughly the same. It's risk, so it'll be risk of drought, or if you like, millions of people at risk of, and millions being in one country or in one location. So people at risk of drought, of flooding, of heat stress, potentially of disease through vector diseases that basically spread better under climate change conditions, Then we could look at food, so loss of crop yield across most major subsistence crops that we all eat. That doesn't matter whether in the UK or further afield. Loss of ecosystem services that we all rely on. The biggie, perhaps, all ecosystems are important: fresh air, clean water, everything that we absolutely rely upon, just species as another animal on the planet. But pollination, pollination is one. If you haven't got the free service of insects pollinating your crops, then times are hard. There's not a great deal you can do, and that goes on really, whether it's ecosystem services, the risks to people, and then going right out again is the economic impact. All of that has a cost. That has a cost to the food that's available, what it is you're paying for food, the cost of the amelioration, the cost of the direct impact, so maybe the cost of flooding, the river flooding, the glacial flooding that Tempa's talking about, that has a cost. And it might not be that a specific business or a specific government has to pay that cost, but it's huge because it's distributed across lots and lots of people who are relying on a reliable flow of water at the times of the year that it's supposed to be a reliable flow, not that it goes from drought to flooding. And then looking at that economics, this isn't just the Tibetan plateau, this is the whole of the Himalayas, which then feeds down into India and feeds down into Bangladesh and feeds the whole of that India, that area of Asia. So it's all completely interconnected in that way, and it's all about risk and cost. Lots of other ways of framing it as well, but that's just the way I'm choosing today.
Okay, thank you, Asher. And I mean, you've both kind of mentioned it in one way or the other, that the UN process and the climate change conferences. One of the things with the original framework convention, both the original framework convention from 1992 and the Paris Agreement from 2015, they both talk about the importance of public education, training, public access to information, public awareness, public participation and international cooperation. And I wonder if you could both tell us something about how they relate to your work, and if I could turn to Tempa first, please.
Thank you very much. I think this is very important. For us, public awareness and public education on climate change has been very, very important. And this is something that we have been able to do a lot. And we have been doing this on to three different audiences. Number one, to the international community, as I mentioned earlier, as we attend UN Climate Summit, and also we organize a big environment conference related to Tibet in different countries. And also we travel to different countries and speak at universities and colleges to highlight about the importance of Tibet Plateau. And as Asher mentioned earlier, that Tibet Plateau is the head source of Asia's greatest rivers. So almost all of Asian rivers come from Tibet. That we tell Asian friends here in Asia that your river comes from us, so pay some attention to us. And then also we talk about the Tibet Plateau as the world's highest and largest plateau. And it's so high and it's so big that it influences climate conditions as far as Europe, and also to some extent to Canada and other regions. So that also we tell them. And then number three, we also tell our Indian friends, and especially in Southeast Asian countries, that the monsoon here in India is also to some extent is influenced by what's happening on the Tibet Plateau. So our first public awareness is to the international community. Try to make the international community aware of why Tibet Plateau is important, so that at least they will give us some recognition and give us some importance. That's number one. And number two, we also make ourselves Tibetans in the exile. aware of why Tibetan are the place that we come from is so important. Not only important, but also what's happening there because of climate change. So we have traveled to almost all Tibetan schools here in India and spoken to students about the Tibet Plateau, why it is, how it was formed, why it is so important, and what's happening there because of climate change. Then we have also traveled to almost all Tibetan monasteries here in India and to tell the Tibetan monks about the Tibet Plateau and its importance and the climate change. And then finally, we have traveled to almost all Tibetan settlements here in India, which are spread across India. So that part has been very successful. Then number 3, and the most important, that which is core of our work, which is to make Tibetans in Tibet aware of what's happening to the Tibet Plateau. Now, this is very difficult, but it's very important for us. So what we do is we give regular radio interview, which can transmit all the way back to Tibet. So there's such a radio such as Radio Free Asia, Voice America, Voice of Tibet. There are 3 radio transmit that goes back to Tibet, and Tibetans listen to those transmissions. So in that, we talk about the Tibet Plateau, and particularly we talk about climate change. Why climate change? Climate change is not an isolated case, it's an international case. And number 2, we tell Tibetans that what's happening in one part of Tibet is not an isolated case, but it's going to happen in all parts of Tibet. And then we also tell them that there will be more and more floods and landslides in the coming years as Tibet to get more and more rain. So we ask them to plant more trees. So that's what we do through radio transmission. And we also make small video clips with about 5 minutes, in which we tell them, we talk about the Tibet Plateau and how it was formed, its geography, its ecological importance, and the impact of climate change, and what could happen, what should be done, mitigation, as UN climate says, mitigation, adaptation. So we tell them. I have specifically asked the Tibetans to change how we build our homes. It's very important because I think some of you been to Tibet, we have built our homes some of our homes are built with the mud walls. So this way, at one point of time, it was needed because it was very cold. Tibet was very cold. So we needed mud walls because that protects the cold wind and also keeps very warm. And also we had flat roofs, which was needed because it gets maximum sunlight. Also, our homes were built on a slope, steep slope, facing either east or south, which means they can get maximum sunlight throughout the day. But now what happens? As Tibet gets warmer and wetter, there are constant floods and landslides. So a lot of landslides happen on those hills where Tibetan homes are located. That's one issue. Number 2, as there's increased rainfall, homes are not able to face the new challenge. And then finally, some Tibetan homes are built on the bank of rivers, because in the past, rivers never, the level of river never surged above a certain point. That was the standard understanding. But in recent years, the rivers surged so high that they've started to inundate whole of village. So we have asked them to shift, where they move away from the rivers, or change how you build or the kind of material they use. That's what we have been try to do through radio in transmission. And number 3, also we have been writing a lot of articles targeting Chinese government. And we publish most of our articles on our exiled government's website, something that Chinese government constantly monitors. So whatever we publish there, they read it, because it's not because they love to read it, because they are monitoring what we say. So we deliberately write articles to highlight what's happening in Tibet on environment issues, mining, damming, and then the removal of Tibetan nomads, and recent years floods and landslides. And we write, and also we give them constructive suggestions, saying we should build more river embankment. And also we tell them that we should plant more trees. So some of these suggestions we put into our article that Chinese government read. And surprisingly, we have seen some good changes, either from our reading our article or from the knowledge that they got from us or from their own understanding. But there are some changes that as we have designed for.
Yeah, I think you make a really important point there, Tempa, is that education and training aren't just about young people in school. The education and training is across, you know, we all need it lifelong to adapt to climate change. And Asher, I wonder if I could ask you this question. How does public engagement and so on relate to your work, please?
I mean, it's a major part of why I do my work. It might not be quite so. Maybe don't get quite so much time to do it as I used to as I've got more senior. But public engagement is really how I got into this. I won't bore you all with my life story, but yeah, I was involved with research work around loss of biodiversity and how that affects ecosystem function. And I knew that this needed to be told to people who were people who needed to know this. So it was, you know, good science, but it needed to be more than just the science paper that it became. And so I just myself, as part-time unofficially, began to engage the very local public to where my field sites were around what this is, what it is we're doing, the way that we do what we do, how it is we know what we know, little open days and things, and then started writing policy briefs and bits and bobs. But that really came across because of what I could see as the need to engage publics, or in this case, it actually just was the general public, in what's happening with biodiversity and what will happen with increased loss of biodiversity, because it, you know, it clearly isn't good and doesn't look good. The difference is we're 25 years on now, and you know the biodiversity loss in those 25 years, the amount of emissions that have gone into the atmosphere in those 25 years have brought about and are bringing about the climate changes and the ecosystem changes exactly as projected by research, current and past. And so engage, I mean, I'll be very unpopular with my colleagues, but I'm not entirely sure we need any more research. We know exactly what's happening. We know exactly the direction of travel. We might be able to fine tune the models a bit and get it to a few more decimal places, or think of a new way of doing this, but we know exactly what's happening. We know what's going to happen further out into the future. And so engaging people with this, empowering with that knowledge, sharing the knowledge, whether that's Tibetan Plateau or United Nations or government businesses, is that, yeah, that's what's important. It's the communication of the science, is the engagement with that science. You know, science isn't finished. It might not even exist until you've told somebody about what it is you're doing and the relevance of what it is you're doing. If you don't do that, it's just a bunch of numbers on a spreadsheet. I see as essential, and that chimes with sort of everything you're saying. So there's the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement itself kind of needs communicating to people, and I think, I mean, I'm not the person to say how many people know the Paris Agreement exists, because I kind of work in that world, but we do know that publics around the world, from so many surveys and social surveys, are concerned about climate change, believe that climate change is happening, they're worried about climate change, and so it's responding to all those information needs, and we're not anywhere near as good as it as we could be. And I think that, yeah, that sort of ties into what is access to information, international relations. So, you know, if there's an article in the Paris Agreement, okay, there's, you know, 1.5 degrees by the end of the century, we're above 1 degree now. there's the adaptation, there's the money, and there's loss and damage and things. But really, one of the most essential bits and a bit overlooked is actually in that engagement bit, the access to information, the communication, cooperation, the bits in there. Because if all that knowledge is only existing within the scientific domain or a very attentive to climate change domain, then yeah, that's not good science. That's important job of science, is to inform those policymakers and political people, but also it really needs to inform everybody else and help people engage and feel empowered with this.
Okay, thank you. And I think we both make an important point that there are many different forms of knowledge that exist in different places, and how we can deploy them all effectively to help face the challenge would be great progress. So I want to turn now to exploring what role you think the public have in helping to drive forward political action and ambition to address climate change. And if I could turn to you first, Tempa, please.
Yes, I think whatever I think the kind of government that each state country has, or the kind of leadership each country has, is a reflection of what the general public considers important. So be it a democratic setup or be it an authoritarian state like China, the government will give importance to an issue that the people of that country consider important. So one such example is what happened to the United States, being a leader of climate change, now somewhat going away from it. And in case of China, at one point of time, China considered development at all costs. So they destroyed environment to a great extent, and they produced unimaginable amount of carbon into the atmosphere. But then in recent years, because of public pressure, China has become a proactive climate activist. The Chinese government is a major player at the UN Climate Summit that we have seen. And it's because of public pressure. And there have been many Chinese leaders who say that climate change is about survival of the CCP, Communist Party of China. So for them, it seems like they are doing, Chinese government is a proactive environment, proactively working on climate change, but it is also about their survival of the CCP, which is a reflection of the public pressure. So the public has a great role. Public is very powerful in every sense. So in the case of the Tibetans here in exile, because the general public knowledge about climate change is so much that His Holiness the Dalai Lama talks about climate change almost every time. And our political leader, the current political leader, Dr. Lobsang Sangye, he talks about climate change almost wherever he can. And then we have our parliament in exile, Speaker of the Parliament in exile also speaks about climate change. So if you listen to any Tibetans, every one of them will have something to say about climate change, either in a brief or detail. But that is because, to some extent, because we are a small community, but to another extent, because there's great public knowledge, and also because there's a lot of emphasis from the higher authority. Similarly, in India, even though India is not a major player at the UN Climate Summit, but here in India, even there's a huge public pressure, and as India develops, people want more better environment. People want clean air. So the Indian government has strict forest rules, and also they are increasing better technology to reduce vehicle pollution. So I think each and every country is doing something on climate change because there's a strong pressure. So I'm not too sure it is nice to say, but almost all of current political leaders across the globe are politicians. So they want to be in the power as long as they can. To be in the power, they want a vote from the public, and public vote to some extent depends on what the public want. And in the current state, in the current scenario, I think there's a great public support for climate change and how to mitigate or how to reduce the impact. So I think public has a strong influence, strong role. And I think we feel very happy that young Greta Thunberg and other teenagers who have come in the forefront of this climate activism. And as teenagers come on the forefront, they are very powerful because every politician, every leader, every scientist are parents of some children. So as children the pressure from the children comes forward to the international community, it has strong impact. So I think this is this public pressure in different form, either from the scientists. I think there's a strong pressure from scientists because there's a general agreement among scientists that climate change is real and urgent. And the only thing is that some politicians, based on their popular vote, have some issues with it. But generally, there's strong views, and the public role is very important in shaping decisions.
Okay, thank you, Tempa. Can I ask Usher? Can I ask you the same question? Have you got anything to add to that?
Not a lot actually, because I completely agree with everything that Tempa said, and about and what I will say is, I think there's absolutely a disconnect between politicians' belief in the public support for the science of climate change and action on climate change. So as I said, all these polls and for decades, years and years and years, all around the world show it as a major issue. Even under COVID in the UK in March, the last poll I looked at, there was 2/3 of people still thought climate change was as equally as important as COVID, and that's when we were all locked down in our houses. The height of lockdown. So the role of the public, which was, I think, was your question, is impressing upon the political leaders, whether it's politicians or just decision makers, that that climate change is very important to them, and that they are engaged with it and they want answers and responses. It's the defining. Tempa's also talking about Greta Thunberg and youth movements as thing. This is the defining topic for this generation, is climate change. If we're looking at things like the Paris Agreement, then this is it. This is the decade of decision making, the 2020s. You either sort climate change out in the next decade, and I'm not just talking about mitigation, just the human response to climate change, or it's going to be a bit too late, pretty much, at least in terms of the Paris Agreement for 1.5 degrees, and we're already just above 1. So I think it's I'm not sure that I would say it's the duty of the public, but for the public to be very aware of that they do have an influence. And I think most of the time the public probably don't think they have an influence, just because things seem to happen. Politicians do whatever it is they're going to do, sort of regardless of everybody else, or even the messaging to the country. But that doesn't have to be the case. You can have a talk about climate change to most people. They know what it is. So much so that mostly I don't say what it is I do for a living, because then the dinner party's ruined because we end up talking about climate change, or the taxi drive or the taxi journey is ruined, or whatever. Sometimes you don't want to be at work. So many, everybody wants to talk about climate change. And if I had uh, that I think is a role that the public can play. Is let's not worry about mitigation policies or adaptation policies, things that the average person can't do too much about, but it's actually to talk about climate change. It's something that isn't spoken about, yet people are worried about it. And what do you do when you've got a worry? You share it with your friends, you talk about it, because otherwise it just gets worse. So just discourse about climate change, so there's more common understanding, people are sharing their worries. That's what I would like to see a lot more of, and that's just people having normal conversations. You know, people are talking about COVID, quite rightly, of course they are. You know, COVID's a terrible situation, but to have other conversations about it. People are talking about our values now and statistics and data and things. That wasn't the case in February. You know, there's a big change that's going on. So I think it's talking about climate change, and I think that's what I would like more of with the publics to be doing, and all those institutions that are responsible for engaging with the public. Then that's something that they could be doing as well, because people want to know about it. It's through public demand.
Okay, fantastic, thank you. And I mean, we've spoken about, both of you, some of the things that you see that seem to be helping to move things forward. But I wonder if you could both say a little bit more about any other projects or initiatives that you've seen that give you personally hope for the future. If we turn to Tempa, please, first.
I think there are many wonderful projects or any initiatives across the globe, but I think I will focus more on what's happening in Tibet. That's something that I know better, as I said earlier. And I think in Tibet, there are three things that I'm really happy about. Number one, in Tibet, there are greater knowledge about climate change and particularly environment in recent years. So there are more and more community organizations which are found by different villages, and they are cleaning up plastic waste being thrown about by tourists on the mountains, on the hillsides, and also they are cleaning plastic waste being dumped near rivers or lakes. So they're cleaning up those. That's one. And number two, and also in Tibet, there are a lot of for Tibet, we don't have like Hollywood stars, but what we have is we have popular singers. For Tibetans, singers are very popular. So we consider them very important, and because they're a lot of times they sing politically sensitive songs, so which is why they become very popular for us. And also there are more and more Tibetan singers who are starting to sing about the importance of environment protection. So this has strong influence on the Tibetan community. And then number three, there's a strong drive by different monasteries to plant trees, afforestation across Tibet, led by monasteries. So now monasteries are very important. For some of you who have less knowledge about Tibet, Tibetan monasteries play important role in influencing Tibetan community. We have a large number of monasteries and monks, and Tibetans give great reverence to monks. So we listen to them. And fortunately, Tibetan lamas, Tibetan important monks start to speak about environment protection and climate change, which is why there's a huge effort by different monasteries in Tibet to plant trees, clean garbage about by tourists or local people. So these are three issues that make me really happy and feel positive about the future, because if I have been telling my fellow Tibetans that what you see in China about the garbage waste being thrown around, if we are not going to do something about it now what's happening in Tibet is because of increased tourists and also bit of development and also urbanization, we are beginning to throw around garbage, plastic waste. It seems like big, but it's not as big as China or India. So it's manageable now. At the moment, it's manageable. So for that, we need public awareness and the government mechanisms to control the waste being dumped around. I tell my fellow Tibetans that we should have to manage it now. If we do it now, it's manageable. If we are not going to do it now, if after 5 or 10 years later, it would be slightly out of control. So by then it will be too difficult to do anything. So fortunately, things are going in the right direction. That's something I'm feeling good about at the moment.
Yeah, very good. Thank you, Tempa. And Asher, if I could ask you the same question, is there anything you've seen that gives you hope for the future?
Well, I mean, I do think things are going in the right direction, even if you can't see emissions declining. In some ways, it might be that emissions aren't globally as increasing as fast as they would be if nobody was paying attention. So I've not got the statistic, I was just trying to recall it, but I mean, in the UK, there hasn't been very much coal burning this year, for example. So yeah, things are changing. I'm not going to quote the number because whatever I do, it will be wrong. But yeah, the significant majority of days have not been coal-fired power stations have not been burning. So that's very sort of a local example on mitigation, and that's because of all sorts of policies, energy policies and economic policies, trying to really shift the way that our economies are powered. And this is all, reducing greenhouse gas emissions is all to do with how economies are powered. But to give a really corny example is, it's not a corny example, it's not the right word, this conversation. Look, I'm sitting in Norwich, you're in Liverpool and London. Tempa is sitting in close to Dharamshala in the foothills of the Himalayas, and we're talking about climate change, public engagement, people who are experience the impacts, what might happen with the future, how that's connected to religion and spirituality and lack of refuse collection and all these things. And so that gives me great hope that these types of conversations and connections are happening the world over. And okay, this is just us talking right now, but there's a lot of other people talking, and there needs to be more conversations about this and more common understanding as we all occupy this planet by sharing bits of it. So I do think that is itself very positive. I was talking about the need for dialogue versus me saying, oh, there's this case study here and this solar farm has been installed here, and some good adaptations and examples. But I think it's bigger than that. It's more cultural, and these types of sort of cultural knowledge exchanges, I think, are essential, and where that might be happening, whether that's through museums or whatever institutions, these are exactly the conversations that want to be happening.
Okay, that leads me, thank you very much, Asha. That leads me very well onto the final question. Is that you've both spoken about kind of different kind of structures or processes for closing some of these gaps. In Tempa's case, looking at how spiritual leaders can help broker the discussions concerning environmental challenges, and Asher with the potential of the internet. And our competition is about looking at how can we reimagine museums to address climate action. But I wonder if I can ask you both, what kind of new kind of institutions or structures, whether it's museums or anything else, have you got any suggestions for what are the kind of things that we need to help close these gaps that exist between policy and public action? If I could turn to Tempa first, please.
Thank you. I'm not too sure I have a very good answer, but I'm not too sure also I give you the right answer as well. So I think, as I mentioned earlier, the concept that you have just come up, reimagining museums, I think it's a wonderful concept. And also because of the COVID-19, and the world has suddenly changed from big conferences to virtual conferences. And this also gives us some positive ideas about how the future where the future could lead. And I think there are 2 points that I really want to make is I think we need to bring more of religious institutions into such, because religious institutions are very powerful, not necessarily to some part of the world, but many part of Asia, it's very powerful. They have a strong influence. So if you could bring them back into such a discussion, they will have a strong influence. And also environmental groups being spread across the different colleges and universities should also be, if we can bring into this platform, that it would also encourage more and more students into that area of climate change. And I think because students are ultimately they are the future leader, and they would probably decide where the future could go. And religious leaders have so much influence that they can shape the current structure, or to some extent political direction as well. So I'm not too sure that's the correct answer, but that's what just came up in my head.
So that's a great answer, and I would say that there are no right or wrong answers in this because we just need to ask the questions. So we'll get the thing to work. And Asher, I wonder if I could ask you the same question. What kind of institutions do we need?
I think yeah, all institutions should be thinking about and articulating climate change to the people that they engage with. And some are, but so many organisations seem to do it behind the scenes a bit. Back to my thing of people aren't talking about it enough. So big banks and all sorts, commission work on climate change, but they don't really say very much about it. They know that their supply chains and their business is at risk if investments are bad investments or whatever because of climate change or stranded assets. But those are things that are sort of kept, not necessarily purposely kept under wraps, but they're not as discussed as they could be. So there's sort of so all institutions should be engaging with and articulating what climate change means to those institutions and the people of those institutions. But yeah, specifically about museums and reimagining museums is, I mean, I have a thing which is really, as I do less traveling now, but I've had jobs where I travel a lot. And I will always go to the municipal museum, whoever the civic museum is in the city that I'm in, because I'm doing something with work. I will always try and go there. And so I've seen probably quite a lot of those sort of institutional museums around the world, the major museum. All brilliant and all very brilliant at reflecting the past, how things used to be, things taken from other places around the world for people to look at. And that's all very important and very interesting, but I think it just becomes novel. Museums are now, and society now is actually about the future. It's what happens next. And I'm not even specifically talking about climate change here. So people's connections with place is pretty much lost for a lot of people. People move around because their works, their economic reasons. So and probably the people who don't are probably the people who can't afford to move mostly. So there's certainly in my mind, a role of museums to be talking more about place into the future rather than place in the historic past. And obviously in the UK, our big museums tend to be Victorian, but all the big city museums tend to be sort of quite old institutions themselves. So it's really it's place now and place into the future. And I think that's where the discourse and the dialogue needs to be. But I also get a sense, and I have no data on this, but because of the nature of our communities now in our society, that's what people are thinking about a bit. But what happens next? So it's the here and now and what happens next, less about here's some artifact from 2,000 years ago. It's the meaning now and the meaning into the future. And I know there's, including you guys, there's brilliant people who could articulate that much better than I can, who live in the world of museums, which I don't. But there's like everything else is shifting, that's something that will shift as well. And I think to very well serve the communities that those institutions are based in as well. I mean, I really don't want to be telling museums people what to do, but this has occurred to me for a long time, and it does fit into public engagement as well. I'm not, it all molds together, I think, and it doesn't just have to be about climate change. That's not specific.
Thank you, Asher. And I think what our kind of general approach with our competition is, we're trying to gather ideas. So all ideas are very, very welcome. And at the end of the day, people can ignore them if they don't want to take them up. So, but I mean, I find that a hugely educational hour. Actually, I've learned so much, and I'm very grateful to you both for taking the time. Asher, in East England, and Tempa where you are in India. And thank you both for your time, and wish you both a good day, and thank everyone for watching as well. So thank you, and goodbye.
Thank you, Henry, and thank you, Colin.